This video, part 2 of the history of Sacred Heart Chapel, describes the 3 stages of interior decoration and renovation of the Sacred Heart Chapel. The first stage was the gradual Baroque-style decorating from 1914 to 1937. The second stage was the simplification of this style of decoration at the time of the Centennial of the Monastery from 1957 to 1959. The third stage occurred in the early 1980s at the time of the celebration of the sesquimillennium of the Benedictine order. It was a radical renovation and expansion. At first, Sacred Heart Chapel had earned the name White Palace of Prayer because of its brightness and natural lighting. That gradually changed during the next 23 years as the sisters began the work of decorating the chapel's interior. First, there was the problem resulting from the installation of stained glass windows from T.C. Esser in Milwaukee. That darkened the chapel so that a lighting system was needed day and night. The lighting system that was gradually introduced became so complex that it detracted from the simplicity of the chapel's interior. There were 625 lights inside the chapel: the chandeliers, pillar brackets, the arch lights, rings of lights in the dome and in the baldachin crown, and the candle-like fixtures in the choir stalls and choir loft. When all were turned on, a magical effect was produced, but it was not without its problems. By 1937, the interior decorating of the Roman Renaissance-style Sacred Heart Chapel was completed. Sister Rosemary Yost, in an article published in Catholic Daily Tribune that year, described the results in glowing terms. The artist in charge of decorating, Joseph Martin, has proven his worth in the exquisite transformation of the chapel, which in its original finish was very fitly called a white palace of prayer, has now been transformed into an exquisite throne room of the Most High. Some of the elements that detracted from the centrality of the altar can be seen in this photo. For example, the ceiling above the altar was painted sky blue with silver curlicues. The lunettes on either side of the altar were filled in with mural oil paintings of the 4 evangelists. The stained glass windows installed in the dome were similar to those in the main chapel, though they were of striking beauty outside at night when the lights were on in chapel. They did not transmit natural light and therefore made the interior of the chapel even darker. This view of the celebration of the Eucharist illustrates the busyness of further decorations which detracted from the centrality of the altar, namely, the 4 oil paintings of the abbesses in the ornate circles over the arches at the base of the dome. These paintings depicted the 4 great Benedictine abbesses: Saint Hildegard, Saint Mechthild, the mystic, Saint Walburga, the healer and patron of Saint Walburg Convent in Eichstätt, Bavaria, from which came the first Benedictine sisters in America, and finally Saint Gertrude, the seraphic. This photo of the college students joining the sisters in the annual celebration of the Feast of Saint Scholastica, foundress of the Benedictine Order of Nuns, was published in the St. Paul Pioneer Press in 1935. For Sunday and feast day chapel services, the students wore caps and gowns. The sisters followed the procession of the clergy and the bishop's train bearers and occupied the choir stalls between the sanctuary and the pews. Note how the spaciousness of the sanctuary lent itself to lush decorations provided by the ferns from the sacristy greenhouse. While some hailed the interior decorating efforts of 1914 to 1937 as remarkably rich, 20 years later, this decorative transformation of the White Palace of Prayer, in the spirit of a rich, exuberant Baroque heritage, would be evaluated.
20 years after the 1937 interior decorating had been completed, the chapel was once again filled with scaffolding. The celebration of the community's centennial in 1957 was an appropriate occasion to consider remedies for the elaborate and confusing decorations and the obsolete lighting. The public address system of the chapel was also inadequate. The Rambusch Decorating Company was consulted for solutions to the interior decorating of the chapel. Robert Rambusch's report for a master plan that would offer an overall coordinating theme for an integrated interior. His observations were helpful in the redecorating efforts in 1957 to 1959, but some were dealt with only later in the more radical structural renovations of the chapel in the early 1980s. Carl Hackert Church Interiors, a company in Chicago, was the final choice for the redecorating contract in 1957 to 1959. It should be noted here that Carl Hackert was a brother of Ottilie, our sister Fidelius, who came from Germany and entered St. Benedict's convent at his suggestion. Hackert agreed with the suggestions of the Rambusch report for the architectural integrity and aesthetics affected many improvements, including all imitation stonework pilasters were replaced with granite pilasters or were chiseled off the side walls, as were the ornate designs around the windows and the murals. The murals in the sanctuary and in the arches under the dome were removed. Sister Jacqueline Dubé and Mark Ingrid of Paris designed new windows which were installed in December of 1958. Pews were refinished with a dull, non-glare varnish. The two sister artists who were most influential in the simplification of the decorations of the chapel's interior in 1958 were Sister Johanna Becker and Jacqueline Dubé. In this photograph, they are examining a stained glass window designed by Sister Jacqueline. The designs were non-figurative, interweaving patterns of both vertical and horizontal movement, giving them a tapestry-like or woven character. Red accents in the large windows formed a cross, symbolizing victory through the cross of darkness to light. Symbols of St. Benedict and St. Scholastica appear in the sanctuary windows. Over 100 different types of glass were used. Antique types of glass together with modern and European and American glass. The lighting fixtures were replaced by frosted glass cylindrical fixtures. These offered some relief from the glare of the old lighting system until the improved recessed lights were installed in the renovation of the 1980s. Roman Zwock, on the right, was a faithful employee who served the sisters in many capacities: college bus driver, convent driver, and maintenance, for 43 years from 1936 to 1979. This photo also shows that a goodly amount of light was transmitted by the new stained glass windows, especially by the upper part of the window with the more delicate colors. One can easily associate the design of the windows with the departure of Saint Benedict from this world, as it is described in the dialogues, a tribute to Saint Gregory the Great. In February of 1959, final touches given to the interior decorations of Sacred Heart Chapel included a new sanctuary lamp, designed by Wilhelm Wagner of New York and handmade of bronze with wire-brushed finish, and Stations of the Cross with figures of buff ceramic clay sculptured by Peter Lupori.
What were the changes that gradually prepared the sisters for the risk-taking decision of a radical renovation of Sacred Heart Chapel? Foremost, the renewal of the church called for by Vatican II Council in 1962 to 1965, which covered every aspect of its life, and church buildings were no exception. The council challenged the church to be the people of God, neither a hierarchical structure nor an ornate building. The ramifications of such understanding of church demanded a radical change in worship, including active participation of the faithful. Hence, the altars in all churches were to be placed in the midst of the people, with the priest facing and interacting with them. This posed a great challenge to most churches, Sacred Heart Chapel included, whose elevated main altars were at one end of the church, the sanctuary. Father Claude Benedictine monk, as diocesan consultant to assist parishes in their experimentations with altar placements, made several designs for the possible location of the altar in Sacred Heart Chapel. The sisters chose the location directly under the dome. In December 1968, a platform was built there for the altar, lectern, and presider's chair. Though this change was a solution to one problem, it created another by doing violence to the overall architectural design of the chapel. Something more radical would be done to arrive at a viable solution to the placement of the altar in the renovations of the 1980s. Another factor which prepared the community for decisions to make some radical changes in Sacred Heart Chapel was the expansion of their high school and college southwestward. This aerial view of the campus, taken in 1972, shows the chapel was no longer the center of the campus. With no obvious public entrance, it was the back of the chapel that faced the hub of activity taking place at the new high school and at the college gymnasium, residence halls, apartments, and especially the new Benedict Arts Center auditorium. It was a challenge to make the chapel the inviting and hospitable center of worship for the entire community living on the campus. Besides the southward expansion of the campus, the new interchange of I-94 just a few miles west of St. Joseph began to give the feeling of a west entrance to the town. It took a number of years for the monastery to adjust to these developments and plan a radical change to the orientation of the monastery campus. In chapter meetings such as the one shown in this photo, all members of the community gather to discuss and vote on important community issues. One such issue was the renovation of the chapel in preparation for the 1980 sesquimillennial celebration of the birth of St. Benedict and St. Scholastica. However, when a huge slab of plaster fell from the ceiling in the dome onto the altar below the dome, while the sisters were praying the Liturgy of the Hours, fired community discussions not only of a touch-up job for the sesquimillennial year, but for a radical renovation of Sacred Heart Chapel. This was the time for the community to act on its awareness that the chapel needed an architectural reorientation in order to provide for the proper placement of the altar under the dome and for a public entrance from the west. By the time of their chapter meeting on October 25, 1980, the sisters' renovation plans had expanded to include an addition to the chapel for a large west entrance and a gathering place, with a reception area and public restrooms. Gradually, other areas were included in the plans, such as a Blessed Sacrament Chapel, Oratory, reconciliation rooms, music rehearsal room, and archives. Actually, the community had already taken two significant steps that prepared it for the radical renovations in the 1980s. First, the experimentation with the placement of the altar under the dome in 1968, and then the experimentation with the Rieger tracker organ and its placement in the transept rather than in the choir loft of the balcony in 1977.
Many questions and fears were answered when the architects Hamel, Green, and Abrahamson provided architectural models of the proposed chapel project. Dreams and plans for the expansion of the chapel became more concrete. The two areas that particularly interested the sisters were the gathering place and oratory. At every stage of the project manager and consultants met with the architects, community committees, community council, and community members to hear the wishes and concerns of the sisters and to shape the project according to liturgical and artistic principles. The unfolding of the chapel project was carefully traced by Darla Miller Shook, who took photographs of all the interesting episodes of the project. Sister Vernice Ramler, besides taking photographs, kept a daily account of the progress of this project. On September 8, 1981, Ray Hermanson, construction architect, and the construction crew took the first visible step in preparation for the ensuing demolition and construction project by putting up a fence encircling the entire site. The sisters had to be content in watching from the outside. However, Sister Ruthelle Decline got locked inside the area. The two sister sacristans packed all valuables into the storage area provided. Sister Christina Herwers, on the left, was associated with sacristy work for 63 years. Sister Elfrida Zierden was associated with liturgy and spent 15 years as a sacristan. Though it must have been painful, they courageously led the way for the project of radical renovation of the chapel to begin. The main altar, on which many sisters had signed their vow formula, was dismantled on September 14, 1981. The Ark of the Tabernacle weighed 500 pounds, and its dome 200 pounds, were taken to the storage area to await a buyer. While the baldachin crown was supported on a scaffolding, the 6 angels were removed. The beauty of these hand-carved angels could now be more fully appreciated close up. Within a few years, the parish of St. Mary's Basilica in Minneapolis, Minnesota, purchased the 6 angels and placed them in the choir nave of the basilica. Sisters from St. Benedict's Monastery and the Basilica Choir together celebrated a prayer service to dedicate the angels in that space. Of the angels, Sister Vernice wrote, "Each of them has its own personality with a mysterious depth of contemplation. The face of each looks so real, and the hands and fingers have so much detail. Creases around the knuckles, and around each fingernail a pink shading." The hand-carved jeweled baldachin crown is being lowered to sanctuary floor. The baldachin was too large to fit on a truck, so it was carried to the storage carpenter shop a block away by workers. Later it was sold to St. Mary's Basilica in Minneapolis and creatively placed it as a baldachin over the Christmas crib.
The windows in the sacristy were the ones that had originally been installed in the Scholastica Hall Chapel in the 1890s, but were moved to the Sacred Heart Chapel when it was built in 1914. In 1982, they were put into storage until later one was placed in the wake area of the gathering place, and the rest were installed in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel at St. Scholastica Convent in St. Cloud in 1988. The Pieta soon attracted a buyer. Mr. and Mrs. Frank Skudlarik bought it for the cemetery at St. Hedwig's Parish in Holdingford, Minnesota. Sister Colleen Haggerty supervised the removal of the altars and statues and their placement in storage during the renovations. She was appointed the physical plant manager for the project of renovating and expanding Sacred Heart Chapel. Sister Mildred Ann, former procurator, continued as consultant for the physical plant projects. The 1980s renovations were planned and supervised by an expert architect, artist, and liturgist, Frank Kaczmarczyk. He was a rare personality who had a vision concerning every aspect of church architecture, and he had the gift of communicating this vision to the sisters to prepare them for the changes and the principles of art and liturgy upon which they were based, especially upon the principles articulated by the Second Vatican Council. Every step of the way was shared with the community, chapter, council, committees, sister liturgists, and theologians. St. John's Abbey, which he joined as a monk in 1983, wrote of him as being an inexhaustible source of creative ideas. This communication was particularly important in the first stages of the renovations, since it involved a good deal of demolition of those things which the community had held dear and sacred. A huge portion of the west nave was separated from the chapel. Note the incision being cut in the roof between the dome and the small sanctuary skylight. The removed portion included the altar end of the sanctuary, the north and south sacristies, the cloister walkway behind the altar, and the storage room below this area. The most critical aspect of the renovation expansion project was this demolition of the west portion of the nave because of the concern for the safety of the dome. The demolition of this portion generated a huge amount of debris that required days of removal. Sister Berenice Ramler described the effects of the demolition of the foundation of this area. She said, "They used a large machine for the demolition ball at the end of the cable and knocked it against the walls of the sacristy. At those moments, the large pillars in the chapel trembled. A person did not know what would happen." No, the dome did not collapse.
Once housing as many as 42 college students, Loretto Hall stands half demolished to make room for the digging of the foundation for the new addition to chapel, the archives, oratory, gathering place, and parking lot. In preparation for this demolition, the sisters built Evan Hall, which the college then rented for students' living quarters in place of Loretto Hall. Along with Loretto Hall, the former powerhouse was also demolished. Digging the foundation of the chapel addition had to be postponed until all the pipes and wires connecting the convent buildings to the power plant were rerouted. These pipes and wires were housed in underground tunnels under the site of the proposed addition to the chapel. This photograph shows the depth of the first two levels of the chapel addition. This depth proved to become a challenge when the water table rose to a record high during the following year. Besides the relics later placed in the reliquary beneath the new altar, some relics were placed in the foundation wall of the expansion of Sacred Heart Chapel. In the early church, it was customary to celebrate the Eucharist over the relics of the saints in the catacombs or tombs. This tradition is recalled in the placing of relics in the foundation of consecrated churches and or in the placement of them in the altar stone. The second level of the chapel addition is an oratory, a place for communal and private prayer. This view from above the construction area shows the placement of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, bottom left, and the curved waked area, bottom right, in the gathering place. In between the two is the kitchenette for the gathering place and the elevator shaft. The upper area to the right of the steel girders and beams for the narthex is the sacristy. These large windows, in addition to the skylight, provide the gathering place with a cheerful, bright atmosphere. The frame of the skylight was constructed on the ground and lifted into place in the gathering place with a crane. A skylight made of insulated fiberglass panels was also installed above the tabernacle area of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel.
The 8 Sienna marble pillars, which had supported the angels and baldachin crown above the tabernacle in the former chapel, now form the west entrance of the renovated chapel, 4 outside and 4 inside the chapel. In the summer of 1982, bricks were cemented on the exterior walls of the new section. For this, Corning Donahue from Stone Creek, Ohio, matched the existing bricks of the chapel. It took the entire summer to finish the trimming on the exterior. The trim is cement dyed to match the terracotta of the trim on the existing chapel. The stained glass angel windows in the dome were removed and later installed in the new chapel in St. Scholastic Convent in St. Cloud. The Rieger organ, purchased in 1977 to replace the 1959 Wicks organ, was removed from the choir loft and sold to the College of St. Benedict. A new organ would be placed in the south nave of the renovated chapel in 1985. The structural shape and color of the predella, altar platform, was similar to that of the balcony, former choir loft, and similar in shape and color to the steps leading from the gathering place in the chapel. The coordination of the color and form of the steps of the predella, the steps leading to the gathering place to the chapel, and the balcony railing create a sense of overall unification in the chapel's design and color. Windows of clear antique hand-blown glass from Germany in a hexagon pattern symbolizing the honeycomb replaced the stained glass windows. This type of window was commonly employed in Baroque churches in southern Bavaria. A dark shade of glass in the windows on the south side of the chapel give them a thermal effect. A mock altar was constructed to experiment with the size and placement of the altar on the predella. Chairs were set up for the Liturgy of the Eucharist to be celebrated in the renovated chapel for the first time on December 22, 1982, 6 months after moving out for renovation. The goal had been to be back in chapel for the Christmas midnight Mass of that year. The Liturgy of the Hours was prayed in the Oratory for the first time on May 7, 1983. The community of sisters, together with guests, gather morning, noon, and evening for these communal prayer services, the official prayer of the Church, called the Divine Office or the Liturgy of the Hours.
The work of landscaping the chapel area began with laying an entirely new network of sidewalks around the 1983 addition to the chapel. The circle drive in front of the entrance to the gathering place provided a green space in which were planted apple trees, whose blossoms in springs reminded the sisters of Mother Benedict's dream of the blossoming growth of the Benedictine Foundation in America. Upon the completion of the Renovation Addition project, St. Benedict's Monastery acquired its first entrance sign.
Finally, on October 24, 1983, came the crowning event of the risk-taking project of the early 1980s, the dedication of the renovation and of the new spaces in Sacred Heart Chapel. Finally, the chapel had a front door and a place to welcome guests to join in the worship of this Benedictine community. Finally, there was the space that invited the sisters to exercise their role in worship and ministry. Finally, a welcoming space invited the presider, the guests, and the sisters to worship as one.